Now we've already spoke about, the wives of the Prophet being excluded from the Ahlul Bayt, but just, to kind of, as they say, to seal the case, we'll mention a couple of more ahadith, because we want to first establish who are the Ahlul Bayt, and then we can delve deeper into the narrations and to understand who are these members, what is the position of Ahlul Bayt, what should our relationship to them be, and then we'll speak about the qualifications of Imam, what is the role of the Imam, what type of wilayah do they have, and so on and so forth. So are the wives part of Ahlul Bayt? We've already answered this question, but there's another tradition that I think it's noteworthy. Zayd ibn Arqam was one of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he lived long after the death of the Prophet. And of course, you can imagine that Sahaba, companions of the Prophet, especially when other people met them, they had celebrity status. That whenever people, second, third generation Muslims, when they would meet, when tabi'een would meet someone who was a Sahabi, they acted the same way that people act when they see a Hollywood star. They were celebrities. So people, whenever they met Sahaba, they would ask them that, tell us something that you heard from the Prophet. So Zayd ibn Arqam, when he was very elderly, he was kind of swarmed by people who wanted to hear a hadith that he had heard from the Prophet. And he says to them, and this is mentioned in Sahih Muslim, and I'll give you the reference shortly. He says to them that I've become elderly and I've forgotten some of the sayings of the Prophet. So he says, I don't remember everything. So except from what I narrate to you. What I narrate to you is what I remember. And don't pressure me to recall things that I can't remember clearly. So do not compel me to tell you. Now, what he clearly remembers, despite his old age, is the following. So this is an incident that, sometimes even elderly people, they might forget what they had for dinner 5 minutes ago, but there are some very fond memories that they have 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they remember it in very great detail. So here Zayd ibn Arqam, a companion of the Prophet who's elderly, who's being surrounded by people to tell them something that he heard from the Prophet, he selects a very fond memory that he has. So what is this fond memory that he has? It's related to Ghadir Khumm. Imagine how important this day was, that this day, Zayd ibn Arqam never forgot it. قام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So I'll quickly read the Arabic and then we'll read the translation. قام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله. By the way, I always say صلى الله عليه وآله, but in the Sihah it says صلى الله عليه وسلم. قام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم يوما فينا خطيبا بماء يدعى خما بين مكة والمدينة. One day the messenger of God stood up to deliver a sermon. Now you can just try to picture this in your mind. All of these people are huddled around Zayd ibn Arqam, and they're anxiously, just like children who are listening to a story, they're listening to Zayd ibn Arqam share the story. So he's saying that the Prophet stood up to deliver a sermon at a watering place known as Khumm, situated between Mecca and Medina. فَحَمِدَ اللَّهَ وَأَثْنَى عَلَيْهِ. The Prophet praised God, he glorified him, وَوَعَظَ وَذَكَّرَ, and he exhorted us and he gave us reminders. أَمَّا بَعْدْ أَلَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ فَإِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ يُوشَكُ أَنْ يَأْتِيَ رَسُولُ رَبِّي فَأُجِيبُ. He says to the people, "O people, I am a human being. I am about to receive a messenger," meaning I'm the angel of death. I'm about to receive a messenger from my Lord. And I, in response to God's call, would bid goodbye to you. وَأَنَا تَارِكٌ فِيكُمْ ثَقَلَيْنِ. I am leaving this world. I'm going to die. I'm a human being. All human beings die. But I'm not leaving you empty-handed. I'm leaving among you two weighty things. أولهما كتاب الله فيه الهدى والنور فخذوا بكتاب الله واستمسكوا به. One of these two things that I'm leaving behind is the book of God, in which there is guidance and there is light. So hold fast to the book of God and adhere to it. Quran, one of the thaqalain is Quran. Adhere to the Quran. He exhorted us to hold fast to the book of God. And then what did he say? فحث على كتاب الله ورغب فيه ثم قال وأهل بيتي أذكركم الله في أهل بيتي. The second are the members of my household. I remind you of your duties to the members of my family, to my Ahlul Bayt. And the narration says that he said this 3 times. I remind you of your duty. أذكركم الله. I remind you of your duty before God to my Ahlul Bayt. And he said this 3 times. It's as though the Prophet knew that the Muslims would not appreciate his Ahlul Bayt. فقال له حسين. There's an individual by the name of Husayn, not Hussein. Husayn ibn Sabra. ومن أهل بيته. So Zayd ibn Arqam, it's a very good question. Who are these Ahlul Bayt who are placed aside the Quran? The Prophet is saying, I'm leaving not just Quran. And that's why that man who said to the Prophet that the Prophet is delirious, we have the book of Allah, it's enough. The Prophet is saying it's not enough. I'm leaving behind Quran and something else that you need in addition to the Quran. My Ahlul Bayt. So Hussein is asking, who are these members of the Ahlul Bayt? أليس نساؤه من أهل بيته? So Hussein is asking Zayd ibn Arqam, aren't his wives part of Ahlul Bayt? قال نساؤه من أهل بيته. That yes, technically they are his family. ولكن أهل بيتي, but Ahlul Bayt are special. They don't include his wives. Yes, his wives are technically, culturally part of his family, but Ahlul Bayt is referring to a specific group. ولكن أهل بيته من حرم الصدقة بعده. His Ahlul Bayt are those for whom acceptance of sadaqah is forbidden. So who are they? قال ومن هم؟ قال هم آل علي وآل عقيل وآل جعفر وآل عباس. قال كل هؤلاء حرم الصدقة. قال نعم. So Zayd ibn Arqam, he had partial knowledge. He got part of it right and then he got part of it wrong. Zayd ibn Arqam knew that wives of the Prophet are excluded, but he mistakenly added more people to the Ahlul Bayt. And by the way, this is not a hadith of the Prophet. You know, the only evidence that they have that, oh, there are more people who are members of the family of the Prophet, they say, oh, because Zayd ibn Arqam says. We say, first of all, Zayd ibn Arqam is not the Prophet, but we accept his exclusion of the wives of the Prophet. But we don't accept his inclusion of the Prophet's cousins and other relatives. Because it seems that Zayd ibn Arqam, he confuses the concept of Sayyid with Ahlul Bayt. Now, Zayd was not a Shia. The point that I'm trying to make is that he knew that the wives were excluded from the Ahlul Bayt. However, he mistakenly believed that the Prophet's cousins and uncle were included, although they are Sayyid, whereby certain rules apply to them. Now, of course, the reason why we have evidence that they're not included, and the most powerful evidence is that the Quran says, يُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمْ رِجْسَ أَهْلِ الْبَيْتِ. Can any Muslim say that anyone other than Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein, can they say that, you know, any of these individuals, the relatives of the Prophet, they're infallible, that they've committed sins? Now we say to Muslims who say that, no, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein, they're not ma'soom, they're not infallible. We say, okay, give us evidence that they committed a sin. They can't. Whereas we can produce evidence that others, they had certain blunders. But that's a separate discussion. The point is that it was understood by the companions of the Prophet that the wives of the Prophet were excluded from the Ahlul Bayt. And to make it even more explicit, Zayd ibn Arqam, he says, in another version of the hadith, he's asked, فَقُلْنَا مَنْ أَهْلُ بَيْتِي نِسَاءُ, aren't the wives of the Prophet members of the Ahlul Bayt? Aren't they included as members of Ahlul Bayt? قَالَ لَا. Zayd ibn Arqam, he says, no. إِنَّ الْمَرْأَةَ تكون مع الرجل العصر من الدهر ثم يطلقها فترجع إلى أبيها وقومها أهل بيته أصله وعصبته الذين حرموا الصدقة بعده. Sayyid ibn Arqam, he says, no, the wives of the Prophet are not his Ahlul Bayt, because a woman lives with a man as his wife for a certain period of time, and then he could divorce her. And if a wife is divorced, she goes back to her family. She goes back to her father and her family. And therefore, Zayd ibn Arqam says, his Ahlul Bayt are those who are related to him through blood. And they are the ones to whom the acceptance of zakat is prohibited. So here, it's very explicit that Zayd ibn Arqam understands that the Ahlul Bayt, that the wives of the Prophet exclude